The living room felt heavy even before I crossed the threshold, though not because of the space itself. My Aunt Linda's house was beautiful, gleaming hardwood floors, expensive rugs with ornate patterns, family portraits in gold-trimmed frames. It wasn't the walls or the furniture that pressed down on me. It was the atmosphere. The air carried the weight of unspoken judgments, the constant undercurrent of comparison that seemed to define every family gathering on my father's side. Success here wasn't measured by kindness or resilience, but by salaries, cars, degrees, and houses. It was a stage, and everyone played their roles carefully, some louder than others. The clinking of glasses punctuated the room like an unwanted metronome, every laugh a little too sharp, every compliment edged with rivalry. I had just set my purse down and smoothed my dress when Rachel approached. Her smile stretched across her face like a well-practiced performance, one she wore for social media pictures and office gatherings alike. She carried herself with that self-assured confidence that only came when life had consistently tilted in her favor. "Emily," she sang out, pulling a small envelope from her handbag, the kind that screamed boutique purchase, rather than drugstore card aisle. "I thought of you." Her voice dripped with sugar, but her eyes glinted with something else, something I knew all too well. I accepted the envelope, already aware that whatever was inside wasn't meant simply as a gift. It was meant as a statement. I tore the flap gently, careful not to show too much haste, and slid out a stiff card embossed with shiny lettering. A department store logo stared back at me, bold and unapologetic. I tilted it in the light, reading the number printed clearly across the front. $120. For interview close, Rachel said in a voice loud enough for the nearby relatives to catch, her words feathered with a mock sympathy that barely hid her delight. You know, something polished, something professional. I looked at her, at the way her head tilted, at the carefully arched brows, at the smug little smirk tucked into the corners of her lips. She wanted me to squirm, to blush, to laugh it off as though I were grateful. She wanted the others to hear, to nod approvingly at her generosity. I forced a smile, lips tight. "Thanks," I said simply, careful not to let my voice crack, careful not to let the irritation pooling in my stomach rise any higher. Rachel's gaze lingered on me for a fraction too long, as if she was waiting for more, for gratitude so overwhelming it might spill over into a confession that yes, she was right. I desperately needed this. But I didn't give her the satisfaction. Around us, I felt the subtle ripple the moment had created. Aunt Linda leaned slightly forward in her chair, her manicured fingers tightening on the stem of her glass. My cousin James, who had just landed his first investment banking position in New York, raised his eyebrows and exchanged a glance with his girlfriend as though they had just witnessed a line delivered in a comedy play. Even my father cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably. Though he said nothing, he never said anything when Rachel pulled stunts like this. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like generosity. A sister supporting another in her job hunt, extending a helping hand. But the truth was visible in Rachel's eyes, sharp and unrelenting. This wasn't about helping me. It was about establishing hierarchy, about reminding everyone present that she was the accomplished one, the one who had it together. I was the project, the work in progress, they could all pity, but never take seriously. And she chose her moment well. It was early in the evening, when everyone's attention was still fresh, when conversations hadn't yet split into quieter corners. The timing was deliberate. The message landed exactly where she wanted it to, right in the center of the family's collective consciousness. I sat back in my chair, holding the gift card carefully, as though it might burn through my skin if I gripped it too tightly. I felt my cheeks warm, though whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't be sure. In my mind, I replayed the way she had said it. For interview clothes, the phrase sticking like a burr. It wasn't just a suggestion that I needed new clothes. It was an implication that I wasn't good enough as I was, that without her assistance I couldn't possibly look the part. Rachel had always been like this. When we were kids, she gave me her old clothes wrapped up as Christmas presents, smiling as though she were giving me the world. When I got into college, she handed me a used laptop with a cracked screen and announced proudly to the family that she had set me up for success. Every gesture, every so-called kindness, came dressed in the same disguise, the appearance of generosity, masking the deeper thrill of superiority. I swallowed hard, my tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, my jaw tight. If I said nothing, I would look ungrateful. If I thanked her too effusively, I would feed her ego. Either way, I was cornered. So I gave her nothing beyond that thin smile, and that single word, thanks. She tilted her head, almost disappointed, then drifted away to join a group by the fireplace, her laughter bright and false. I sat with the envelope in my lap, the $120 card glaring up at me, not as a gift, but as a brand, a label I had been unwillingly marked with. To them, I was the underdog, the one who hadn't yet reached her potential, the one still figuring things out. And Rachel's gift had crystallized that belief into something tangible, something they could all nod at and remember. Emily needed help. Rachel provided it. End of story. But deep down, beneath the flush of humiliation, something hardened in me. They thought they knew my story. They thought they could sum me up in $120. And in that moment, though I said nothing, I knew they were wrong. The gift card should have been enough humiliation for one night. But in this family, one blow never came alone. Once the first spark was lit, others rushed to fan the flame, piling on with little comments, as though mocking me was an unspoken group sport. Dinner had settled into its rhythm, the clatter of silverware against porcelain, the low hum of overlapping conversations, laughter that came too sharp and too sudden. The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary, but the taste in my mouth was bitter, heavy with restraint. I picked at my plate, pushing the vegetables around, while every sound seemed to sharpen against my nerves. It was Aunt Linda who fired the next shot. She leaned close to my mother, her perfume clouding the air. Something powdery, suffocating like roses left too long in a vase. Her lips barely moved, but her voice carried in that deliberate way people whisper when they don't actually want to keep a secret. Emily's 25. Still no real career. What's she going to do with her life? The words slithered into my ears, precise and cutting. They weren't asked out of curiosity, but out of satisfaction, as if my so-called lack of direction gave her life order. Linda had always thrived on comparison. Her own children were stepping stones she polished and displayed. Her son with his medical residency, her daughter with her law firm internship. To her, success wasn't just achievement, it was ammunition. And I, sitting across the table, had just been positioned as the convenient target. My mother gave a nervous chuckle, one of those brittle, paper-thin sounds she used when cornered. She didn't defend me. She never did, not directly. Instead, she said something vague about how these things take time, which only underscored Linda's point. My mother's silence stung more than Linda's jab. I felt every muscle in my shoulders tighten. My fork hovered uselessly above my plate. I could have snapped back, reminded Linda that not every life needed to follow the predictable blueprint she worshipped, but the words stuck in my throat. I could feel the others listening, not with their ears, but with that hungry stillness that fills a room when gossip shifts its aim. And then, like clockwork, came Mark. My older brother had always found joy in making me the punchline. Where Rachel's condescension was disguised as grace, Mark's was blunt and shameless, always hunting for the laugh, even if it cut deep. He sat 2 chairs down, nursing his glass of wine with the cocky ease of someone who believed the world owed him admiration simply for showing up. He tipped the glass too far, accidentally spilling red wine across the crisp white tablecloth. The liquid spread quickly, branching like veins across the fabric. Gasps broke out, but he only grinned, holding the glass aloft like a victorious knight. "Oops," he said, glancing at me with deliberate mischief. "Guess that's about as stable as Emily's finances." Laughter erupted. Not from everyone, but enough. Cousin James slapped the table, nearly choking on his drink. Even Aunt Linda let out a sharp chuckle, her earlier whisper now punctuated with visible amusement. My cheeks burned hot, a flush that started at my collar and spread upward until it felt like my whole face was on fire. I pressed my lips together, refusing to give them the tremble they were looking for. The wine stain boiled deeper into the cloth, and though it had nothing to do with me, I felt branded by it, as if Mark's careless gesture had been designed to mirror the family's perception of me. Messy, unstable, uncontained. The sting of it all was not just in their words, but in the ease with which they threw them. To them, I was fair game, an acceptable target for jokes, whispers, and side comments that would have been cruel in any other setting. Here, it was tradition. My silence had always been taken as consent, my endurance mistaken for weakness. But as their laughter swelled, and then gradually ebbed into the background, I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing steadying despite the fire in my chest. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was poor, stuck, dependent on scraps like Rachel's gift card. They thought I had no comeback, no defense, no life outside the little box they had built for me in their minds. The truth sat quietly in my heart, pulsing like a secret too potent to reveal. They didn't know what I had been building behind the scenes, the nights of work, the risks I had taken, the doors I had unlocked when no one was watching. They didn't know that their contempt wasn't just misplaced, it was outdated. For now, I let them laugh. I let the whispers sting. I let the wine spread across the tablecloth like a metaphor they couldn't even grasp, because I knew something they didn't. And while my cheeks still burned, somewhere deep inside, a different kind of fire had begun to glow, steady, certain, waiting. The house had settled into its usual evening cadence, forks clinking against plates, a cousin recounting some promotion story for the 3rd time, the occasional burst of laughter too sharp to be genuine. But beneath that surface noise, a tension still lingered, like the static in the air before a storm. I had kept quiet, my silence mistaken for submission, while the barbs of Rachel, Linda, and Mark clung to the edges of the room like smoke. They believed they'd won, that the narrative of the night was theirs to control. Then it began. At first, it was just a faint hum, so low it could have been mistaken for distant thunder. A few heads tilted, puzzled but unconcerned, as if they were trying to decide whether the weather had changed. But the sound deepened quickly, vibrating through the floorboards, pressing against the glass panes with invisible force. The laughter faltered. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The windows trembled. Glasses on the table quivered, their contents rippling in delicate concentric circles. The thrum grew into a steady rhythm, mechanical and commanding, impossible to ignore. A murmur passed through the room like a wave breaking on sand. Questions whispered. Speculations mumbled. Confusion painted across every face. I already knew what was happening. My chest tightened, but not with fear, with anticipation. The moment I had kept folded and hidden like a secret letter was unfolding before their eyes. Through the wide bay window, a brilliant beam of light cut across the darkening lawn, slicing through shadows and igniting gasps around the table. The searchlight swept slowly, deliberately, painting the grass silver before settling against the side of the house. The reflection bounced across wine glasses and picture frames, stark and theatrical. Rachel was the first to freeze. Her fork hovered midway to her mouth, her lips parted but soundless, her eyes wide as if she'd seen something she couldn't reconcile with the script she'd been writing all evening. Mark's smirk, the one he wore like armor, the one that had carried him through every cruel joke, faltered. The curve of it slipped, leaving his mouth hanging in confusion, his glass of wine still in his hand but forgotten. And my father, who never startled, never showed emotion beyond a controlled nod or a measured frown, straightened so suddenly it was as though an invisible string had tugged him upright. His jaw slackened, and for once, he looked not like the immovable patriarch, but like a man witnessing something he had no language for. The thrum became a roar. The helicopter descended, the blades slicing the air with violent precision. Napkins fluttered against the tablecloth, candles flickered and bent their flames, and the sound was so consuming, it seemed to drive every other thought out of the room. It was more than noise. It was power manifested, vibrating against the chest, demanding acknowledgement. The glasses on the table rattled against porcelain saucers, spoons danced faintly in their bowls, and every pair of eyes turned toward the window in stunned disbelief. The yard, moments ago a simple stretch of manicured lawn, had become a stage under the beam of the helicopter's light. I rose slowly, every movement deliberate. My chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor, the only sound in the room that wasn't swallowed by the mechanical thunder outside. I smoothed the wrinkles from my dress with calm hands, feeling the weight of their gazes, their confusion, their dawning realization pressing against me like heat. For a fleeting second, I let myself savor it. The reversal, the shift, the way the room had transformed from a place of ridicule to a place of awe in less than a minute. All their whispered judgments, their smirks, their laughter. It hung in the air now, fragile and absurd, like balloons suddenly deflating. I didn't rush. I didn't stumble. I didn't explain. I simply walked toward the door, each step echoing with quiet defiance. The rhythm of the rotors outside matched the steady beat of my heart, louder, stronger, unshakable. The murmurs followed me as I crossed the room. Who? What is that? Is it? For her? They tried to make sense of it, their voices sharp with disbelief, but none dared say it aloud with certainty, because to do so would mean acknowledging that the girl they had mocked, belittled, and dismissed was not the figure they thought they knew. My hand touched the cool brass of the door handle, and I felt the vibrations of the machine outside humming through the wood. Behind me, silence reigned. Even Mark, so quick with his barbs, so desperate for the last laugh, had nothing. Rachel, always ready with a cutting remark disguised as concern, sat stiff, her mouth pinched tight as though she'd bitten into something sour. I straightened my shoulders. With one final breath, steady and calm, I opened the door to the rush of wind and the thunder of the blades. The air whipped around me, sharp and electric, carrying with it the scent of jet fuel and nightfall. The world outside was alight with power, and for the first time that evening, I stepped into it fully, not as their subject of pity or mockery, but as the author of a story they had never seen coming. And I didn't look back. As the helicopter settled into its hover, the lawn flattened beneath the rotor wash like a field of wheat pressed by a passing storm. The pilot, helmeted, visor up, stepped out, his boots sinking a fraction into the soft grass. He moved with quick, economical gestures, unhooking a latch and swinging the cabin door open for me. A rush of turbine-warmed air rolled across the patio, carrying the sting of jet fuel and turned earth. Behind me, the chorus of gasps came not as a single sound, but in ripples. First, the nearest relatives, then those farther back who caught the sight in the reflections on glass and polished silver. I turned toward the dining room. Faces hung in mid-expression, arrested by the beam of the searchlight that had painted the windows in shifting bands. The house, moments ago a theater of soft cruelty and easy laughter, had become a gallery of astonishment. For once, there was no performance to maintain. No one had the right line ready. "You see," I said, and my voice surprised me with its steadiness, the way it threaded cleanly through the mechanical thunder. "While you all assumed I was struggling, I was building something of my own. I invested in a tech startup 3 years ago. Last month, it went public. I didn't share it, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew how quick you are to judge success only by appearances." The words did not float. They landed. Rachel's color vanished, as if drained by a switch. The delicate polish of her composure, so careful, so curated, cracked in fine hairlines at the corners of her mouth. She had always preferred her victories public and her efforts visible. In her world, achievement was scenery, arranged for others to admire. The possibility that I had carried out my work in silence, without telegraph, without audience, conflicted with the tight cosmology she lived by. She blinked once, twice, as if her mind were trying to refocus the image before her into something more familiar. Mark's knuckles blanched around the bowl of his wineglass. For him, a gag worked only if the audience recognized the premise. The premise had changed. His smirk, the practiced half-curl that insulated him from consequences, fell away and left him barefaced, boyish, almost uncertain. He looked down, then back up, as though the tablecloth might offer an alternative explanation the room had missed. Aunt Linda set her own glass down with exaggerated care, as though any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile logic held her world in place. She wore the expression of someone watching a magician repeat a trick up close, eyes narrowed, searching for strings, mirrors, the concealed compartment where the truth must surely be hidden. She had spent years measuring me in whispered increments, calibrating her concern in public while privately compiling a ledger of my delays. What she found hardest to accept was not that I had succeeded, but that I had done it out of reach of her scale. My mother's hand crept toward her necklace, a reflex more than a choice. She was the only one whose eyes softened rather than hardened, an instinctive sympathy struggling against years of training to maintain harmony at any cost. She looked at me, then at the halo of light spilling across the floor, and her lips parted with wonder she seemed afraid to claim. My father straightened as if a long-forgotten command had summoned him to attention. He had built his identity from steadiness, paychecks delivered with punctuality, expectations enforced without spectacle. In his quiet code, respect was reserved for what was proven and sturdy. He had never asked what I did after dinner, or why the desk lamp in my apartment glowed past midnight. He had simply assumed that silence meant drift. Now, confronted with evidence that silence had meant discipline, he wrestled with the miscalculation like a man retracing a map he himself had drawn. I didn't talk about it, I continued, because I learned early that some people hear risk and translate it into reckless, and some hear quiet and translate it into failure. I didn't need those translations. A memory flashed, not the cinematic kind, but a bodily impression. The hum of my cheap monitor at 1:17 a.m., the acid taste of black coffee cooling too slowly, a spreadsheet of burn rates, a signed term sheet that looked more like a cliff's edge than a parachute. I put in a small check when most people would have told me to keep it safe. I put in time. I put in nights. I put in my patience. The helicopter's blades kept their relentless cadence, a metronome that underscored every word. Plates trembled faintly in their chargers. The flame of a tapered candle near the centerpiece thinned and leaned, then stood up stubbornly again. Rachel recovered first, not with speech, but with posture. She arranged her shoulders into a shape that signaled poise. An instinctive recalculation crossed her face. The skill set of a woman who had learned to pivot mid-sentence when a meeting turned. A startup? She ventured, as if naming it might shrink it. You, invested? Her tone tried for casual and arrived at brittle. Yes. I let the single syllable rest, unadorned. There would be time later to answer what I chose to answer. Not now. Mark exhaled through his nose, an aborted laugh caught halfway, his default exit ramp when cornered. So what, you? Got lucky? He made the words sound like a lifeline. Something he could cling to that would keep the world familiar. Luck, not judgment. Windfall, not work. Luck was the door, I said. Preparation was the key. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Aunt Linda cleared her throat, the prelude she used before appointing herself moderator. Well, she said, aiming for patronage and landing closer to plea. That's certainly exciting. But these things, they're very volatile. You'll want to be prudent. It was an attempt to reassert expertise by moving the conversation into the domain of caution, where she believed age conferred an automatic edge. I've been prudent for 3 years, I replied, prudent enough to wait until there was something to say. My mother's voice came soft, threaded with disbelief and pride both. Why didn't you tell us? It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession that if she had known, she would have protected that knowledge like a candle popped in 2 hands. Because telling you early would have turned the work into spectacle, I said, and spectacle devours patience. I glanced around the table. I needed patience more than I needed applause. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to shift on its axis. The trophies mounted on Aunt Linda's wall, the oil painting of a harbor at dusk, the sparkle of crystal, all of it remained, and yet none of it mattered. What mattered was the recalibration happening behind their eyes. The story they had told themselves about me had required no evidence. The story before them now offered nothing but. James, quiet until then, scratched at the condensation on his glass. What company? He asked, curiosity bleeding through the careful neutrality of the question. In his world, names were currency. I allowed myself a small smile that didn't show teeth. "You can read the filings," I said. "They're public." Silence followed, not empty, not awkward, but dense, like the air before rain. The pilot waited by the open door, gaze respectfully averted, the machine at his back thrumming in patient readiness. The porch light gilded the threshold where I stood, 1 foot in the house that had misnamed me, 1 foot in the night that had carried my secret work. I met each gaze in turn, not to gloat, not to punish, but to allow the new information to anchor. Rachel's pupils dilated, calculation and something like humility warring behind them. Mark's grip loosened by a fraction. The glass creaked, then held. Aunt Linda's mouth compressed around a sentence she wisely chose not to deliver. My father's jaw worked once, twice. Words rose and receded. My mother's eyes shone. "I didn't dress it up," I said, quieter now, the roar outside filling the spaces around each syllable. "I didn't frame it, or post it, or ask you to clap, while it was still a seed. I planted it. I watered it. I waited. That's the whole of it." No one moved. The searchlight slipped off the window and slid across the ceiling like a slow comet. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer clicked to the end of a forgotten cycle and stopped. The smell of rosemary and heat clasped hands with jet fuel in the doorway, and for the first time all evening, I felt light in my bones. Light, not from vindication, but from accuracy. The room finally contained the right story. I let the moment stand, unhurried and uncompromised, the turbine's steady heartbeat marking time while the old narrative dissolved, molecule by molecule, into the night air. For once, no one laughed, no one whispered. The absence of sound filled the dining room with a pressure more suffocating than all their earlier derision combined. The same mouths that had curled with amusement when Rachel presented her patronizing gift, the same voices that had chuckled at Mark's staged spill, now stayed frozen, as though any movement might shatter the fragile air that had descended upon them. I let the silence stretch. Silence had always been their weapon, those awkward pauses designed to make me rush in and explain myself, to fill the space with apologies or nervous chatter. But now the silence was mine. I held it deliberately, letting them sit in their discomfort, forcing them to confront the hollowness of the stories they had told themselves about me. Rachel sat nearest, the $120 gift card still pinched between her manicure fingers, its glossy surface catching the reflection of the chandelier. She hadn't moved since my words cut through the room, as though her body had stalled, mid-gesture, mid-thought. Her hand trembled faintly, a betrayal of the poise she was so desperate to maintain. I studied her, not with cruelty, but with clarity. "Thank you for the gift," I said softly. My tone was not sharp, not mocking. It was even, level, the kind of tone that made every syllable land with more weight than shouting ever could. "I'll keep it, not because I need it, but because it'll remind me how far I've come." The words hovered in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Rachel's face shifted, her cheeks blanching, and then blooming faintly red, as though the meaning behind my gratitude had finally pierced through her armor. She blinked, once, then twice, her eyes darting from me to the others, seeking rescue but finding none. For the first time in years, she had no script to rely on. The silence that followed was not neutral, it was deafening. I could almost hear their thoughts clattering into one another, trying and failing to rearrange themselves into something coherent. Even Mark, who never passed up the chance to twist a knife, had his smirk erased, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line as he stared at his untouched wine glass, still rigid in his hand. My mother's eyes shimmered, catching the candlelight, and for once I saw her pride unmasked. It was not the small, hesitant pride she showed in front of others, the kind that lived in half smiles and quick nods. This was different. Her gaze lingered steady, as if she were seeing me for the first time, not as the child she needed to defend, nor the daughter she'd worried over, but as a woman who had built something undeniable. Her lips parted, but no words came. None were needed. My father cleared his throat. That single sound had the gravity of a speech, for he was not a man prone to many words. The gesture alone revealed his shift, the attempt to reassemble dignity in the face of a truth he could neither dismiss nor claim credit for. His silence wasn't indifference this time. It was concession. For him, acknowledgement came in that throat clearing, in the way his eyes met mine briefly before flicking away, as though admitting he had underestimated me was easier without prolonged contact. I didn't rush. My body moved with the calmness of someone finally free from the weight of proof. I stepped away from the table slowly, letting my heels click against the hardwood floor, each sound a punctuation mark against their stillness. The shift wasn't just in their perception of me. It was in my perception of myself. I was no longer shrieking beneath their scrutiny, no longer a silhouette cast by their judgments. I was whole, standing, visible. The air near the doorway pulsed with the rhythm of the helicopter outside. Each beat of the rotors vibrated through the walls, rattling the glassware faintly, reminding everyone that this moment wasn't fleeting. It was anchored, loud, and impossible to ignore. The cool night air spilled into the house as I opened the door, sweeping past me like a tide, lifting the heavy scent of roasted chicken and wine and replacing it with jet fuel and cut grass. I paused on the threshold, letting the chill settle against my skin, letting the rush of wind weave through my hair. Behind me, I felt their eyes, wide and searching, trying to reconcile the girl they had pitied with the woman walking toward a machine that belonged to a different world entirely. For the first time in years, I wasn't the underestimated one. I wasn't the punchline, the afterthought, the subject of whispered doubts. The roles had reversed, and they knew it. I was the one they would never forget, not because of spectacle, not because of revenge, but because truth has a way of engraving itself into memory when it's finally revealed. And as I stepped into the night, the air rushing over me with the force of everything I had earned, I understood with crystalline clarity. The balance of power had shifted forever. The helicopter lifted from the lawn with a surge of power that pressed me gently into the leather seat. The vibration pulsed through the cabin, steady and insistent, a heartbeat made of steel and air. Outside, the yard fell away in increments, the trimmed hedges shrinking, the patio lights flickering like distant lanterns, the carefully arranged dinner scene dissolving into a tableau of stunned faces rooted in the grass. Through the window, I looked down at them. They stood scattered in uneven formation, their bodies drawn toward one another, yet separated by invisible walls of pride and confusion. No one moved. No one gestured. They simply stared upward, their expressions illuminated in fragments by the searchlight still slicing across the lawn. It was almost surreal. These were the people who had, for years, crafted my identity in absentia, speaking of me in half smiles and sighs, their words heavy with disappointment. They had called me poor, not only in wealth but in vision, in direction, in ambition. They had mocked my pauses, my hesitations, my choice to stay silent rather than parade every effort. They had mistaken quiet for emptiness. And now they stood there, powerless to label me ever again. Rachel still clutched the gift card, though now it looked absurdly small in her hand, a trinket from a bygone script. Her posture had collapsed, no longer the practiced elegance of a woman in control, but the stiff uncertainty of someone caught miscalculating. Mark's jaw hung slightly open, the smirk gone, his hand still hovering with that half-forgotten wineglass like a relic from a play that had ended mid-act. Even Linda, who had always wrapped her judgments in silk and subtlety, stood exposed, her face frozen in disbelief, as if the language she'd spent years perfecting had failed her when she needed it most. The sight of them filled me not with triumphal gloating but with a quieter, deeper satisfaction. The real victory wasn't in the wealth, or the machine lifting me skyward, or the sheer spectacle of the moment. It was in what remained unsayed. I hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to slam my hand against the table, or hurl their cruelty back at them. I had let silence carry my strength, revealed at the moment when it could no longer be denied. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it lingers in the background, patient, waiting, storing itself like energy in a coil until the precise moment arrives to unspool. Tonight had been that moment. Their laughter had been the spark, but the blaze had been mine to light. The rotors beat a relentless rhythm, drowning out every trace of the whispers that had haunted me in that room. With each rotation, it felt as though the helicopter was erasing the residue of every slight, every cutting remark disguised as concern, every patronizing nod. The air was sharp, electric, carrying away the weight that had pressed on my shoulders for years. I leaned my head against the window and let the cool glass press against my temple. From this angle, the house looked smaller than it had ever seemed, its grandeur diminished under the wash of light and shadow. The people gathered outside were reduced to outlines, their details fading as the aircraft rose higher. And yet I knew the impression etched into them tonight would not fade so easily. What mattered most was not that they admired me now, but that they understood they could no longer dismiss me. I had rewritten the unspoken contract that had governed every family gathering, the one where I played the role of the struggling younger sibling, the one who needed guidance, pity, correction. That contract had been torn apart the moment the helicopter's blades cut the night air. In its place stood a new truth. I was not the weak one anymore. As the cabin steadied and the pilot leveled our ascent, I let the final words settle in my own mind, not as a declaration for them, but as a promise to myself. I was Emily Carter, not the shadow of their expectations, not the echo of their judgment, but the woman who had quietly turned their contempt into admiration. And in the hush between the roar of the blades and the thrum of my own heartbeat, I understood the essence of the moment. Vindication isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes as a stillness, a clarity, a freedom that requires no witness. Tonight, I carried that freedom with me, rising higher above the house, above the whispers, above the limits they had drawn for me. The night opened wide before me, vast and dark and infinite. For the first time, I felt its expanse not as uncertainty, but as possibility. And below, on the shrinking lawn, they kept staring upward, toward me, toward the truth they had never expected to see.